My cousin asked me to take care of his house while he was away for New Year's, and I reluctantly agreed. He lives in a big house, kind of isolated. The type of place that feels a little creepy at night, you know? But I figured it'd be a good chance to relax and binge some series without anyone bothering me. At first, everything was fine. I made myself a snack, put on a movie, and was enjoying the peace and quiet when the doorbell rang. It was weird because he hadn't mentioned expecting anyone. At the door, there was this guy who seemed friendly enough. He introduced himself as an old friend of my cousin's and said he'd left something important at the house. He even knew details only someone close to my cousin would know, like the name of a dog he had years ago and the story about the kitchen renovation. I was a little suspicious, but the guy seemed to know too much to be just some random stranger. So, I let him in. He went straight to an upstairs bedroom, grabbed something, thanked me, and left quickly. It all seemed casual enough that I didn't think much about it at the time. After the guy left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't have let him in. How did he know all that stuff about my cousin? I decided to text my cousin, just to confirm if he knew someone like that. His reply came almost instantly. I have no idea who that is. You let a stranger into my house? My stomach dropped. I tried to explain that the guy seemed to know so much about him, but my cousin insisted he didn't have any friend matching that description. That's when I started feeling really uneasy. It was late, and there wasn't much I could do except try to forget about it. I locked up the whole house, double-checked all the doors and windows, and put on another movie to distract myself. But I couldn't relax. Around 2 a.m., I started hearing noises upstairs, like someone walking around. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sounds got clearer, slow, heavy footsteps. I froze, trying to figure out how that was even possible. I knew I was supposed to be alone in the house. I grabbed the first thing I could use as a weapon, a baseball bat my cousin kept in a closet near the living room. I went up the stairs as quietly as I could, trying not to make any noise. Each step creaked, and my breathing felt way too loud. When I got to the upstairs hallway, the footsteps suddenly stopped. Everything went dead silent, like the house itself was holding its breath with me. I started checking the rooms one by one, pushing the doors open slowly with the bat raised. There was no one. I stood in the hallway, trying to make sense of it, when I heard something else, a whisper, coming from the room the guy had gone into earlier. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like more than one person. My heart was pounding. I threw the door open, expecting to find someone, but the room was empty. The only weird thing was that the window was unlocked. I was sure I had locked everything before going upstairs. I went over to lock it again, and that's when I saw it. The back door of the house, downstairs, wide open and swinging in the wind. I practically ran down the stairs, still holding the bat. When I got to the kitchen, I felt this chill down my spine. The back door was open, but the lock wasn't broken. It looked like someone had unlocked it from the inside. I quickly checked the rest of the house, trying to find some kind of explanation, but everything seemed normal. No signs of a break-in, nothing out of place. The weirdest part was that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like someone was still there, hiding, waiting. I locked the back door as fast as I could and dragged a chair to sit in the kitchen. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. I sat there, listening to every creak and sound the house made, convincing myself it was just paranoia. But then came the worst part. Around 3 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't coming from upstairs. They were heading toward the kitchen, from the dark hallway. The lights flickered for a second, and I swear I saw something move toward me. I jumped to my feet so fast I nearly knocked over the chair. My instinct was to grip the baseball bat tighter and stay close to the door, ready to run if I had to. The footsteps stopped abruptly, right at the entrance to the hallway. But I didn't see anything, just darkness. I stood there, trying to hear something, anything, until the whispering started again. It was low, almost impossible to catch, but it was there, cutting through the silence. This time, it sounded clearer, like a voice trying to say my name. I've never felt fear like that before. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I dropped everything and bolted out the back door, locking it behind me. I sat in my car until the sun came up, staring at the house, waiting to see any sign of movement. When daylight finally came, I worked up the courage to go back inside. The strange thing was, everything was in order, like nothing had happened. But the back door, it was open again, even though I had locked it before running out. At that point, I knew I couldn't stay there another minute. I grabbed my stuff and went straight to my parents' house. I told my cousin everything later, and he was just as freaked out as I was. He said it didn't make any sense. The house had never had anything weird happen before. He even suggested that maybe I'd imagined some of it because I was on edge, but I knew that wasn't it. I felt those footsteps, I heard those whispers, and that door being unlocked again. There's no explanation for that. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he really did in the house that night. My cousin installed security cameras after that, but nothing strange has been caught on them. Even so, I can't shake the feeling that there was something, or someone, there with me that night, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Every New Year's, this memory creeps back, and since then, I've never spent another New Year's Eve alone. I never let strangers get into my relatives' houses again. Every year, my family organizes a party at my parents' house for New Year's. It's the typical noisy gathering, cousins scattered around playing cards, uncles arguing about politics, and kids running everywhere. But as the night drags on and everyone's stuffed with food, things start to slow down. It was around 2 a.m. when I noticed how quiet the house had gotten. Most people had either left or passed out somewhere. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, almost dozing off, when I first heard that static sound coming from the basement. At first, it didn't alarm me. I thought it was just the TV left on or maybe some old appliance still plugged in. But the more I listened, the weirder it seemed. The sound was too present, too loud to ignore. It took me a while to work up the courage to move. I've always hated that basement. It's damp, poorly lit, and packed with random junk my family's hoarded over the years. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight since the basement light would flicker sometimes, and I headed down the stairs slowly. The static grew louder with every step, like it was calling me. When I finally reached the bottom, my phone's light landed on an old radio, one of those vintage wooden ones with the dials. It was tuned to a classical music station, but all it played was static, occasionally interrupted by short, off-key snippets of melody. The weird part? That radio hadn't been used in years. It was just there, sitting between boxes of old decorations, collecting dust. My first instinct was to turn it off. Obviously, it wasn't supposed to be working. As far as I knew, it didn't even have a power cord anymore. My dad had said once that he cut it off because the thing used to give shocks. But there it was, blaring static like it was brand new. I picked it up carefully, flipping it over to look for some logical explanation. Sure enough, the cord was completely severed, just like my dad had said. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to twist the volume knob to turn it off, just in case. The sound stopped instantly, and the room fell into an eerie silence. For a few seconds, I just stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The static was gone, and the basement went back to being the quiet, creepy place it had always been. But before I could go back upstairs, the sound started again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was in the air around me, filling every corner of the basement. The pressure was overwhelming. I can't explain it, but it felt like the sound had weight, pressing against my chest. My hands shook as I swept my phone's flashlight across the room, looking for the source, but there was nothing there. Before I could even react, the lights in the entire house began to flicker. It was like something was draining the power. The static grew louder, almost like it was feeding off the electricity. My mom, always dramatic after a couple of beers, started praying quietly, which was something I'd never seen her do before. The panic on her face made everything worse. I decided to grab the radio again, thinking maybe it was the key to stopping whatever was happening. I ran back down to the basement, but when I got there, the radio was gone. Even though I knew no one else had been down there with me, I searched everywhere, opening boxes, tossing stuff aside, but the radio had vanished. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Written on the brick wall above where the radio had been was a message, scrawled in what looked like charcoal or soot. The letters were uneven and faint, but I could read them. Do not turn it off. My heart nearly stopped. That definitely hadn't been there before. I tried to scream, to call for someone, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. The static grew louder, almost deafening, like it was alive. I stumbled back up the stairs, my only thought being to get out of the house. When I reached the living room, my mom was standing by the front door, staring at it. She whispered that someone was outside. Her voice was so soft I could barely hear her. I looked at the door, but I couldn't see anything through the curtains. Still, the feeling of being watched was so intense it made my skin crawl. Summoning every bit of courage I had, I went to the door, with my mom right behind me. As soon as I opened it, the static stopped. The street was empty, lit only by the dim glow of the streetlights. There was no sign of movement. I stood there, breathing in the cold night air, trying to piece everything together. And then I saw it, sitting at the edge of our front yard. The radio? It looked untouched, almost like it had been placed there on purpose, like a warning. My mom stayed by the door, begging me to come back inside, but I couldn't take my eyes off the radio. Even from a distance, I could see the volume knob was turned all the way up. I walked toward it slowly, every instinct in me screaming that I shouldn't. The silence around me was worse than the static, thick, suffocating. When I finally got close enough, I reached out to touch the radio. The second my fingers brushed against it, the sound came back, louder than ever. But this time, it wasn't just static. There were voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once, screaming from inside the radio. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded desperate, like cries for help mixed with anger. I let go of the radio and stumbled back, my mind racing. Then the streetlight started flickering, just like in the house. I turned around and saw my mom still standing in the doorway, gripping the frame like her life depended on it. She was yelling something, but the radio drowned her out completely. Without thinking, I ran back into the house and grabbed the first heavy thing I could find, a hammer from my dad's tool cabinet. My mom was still at the door, pleading for me to come back inside, but all I could focus on was ending whatever this was. I sprinted back to the yard, where the radio was still blaring those horrible voices. With both hands, I swung the hammer down as hard as I could. The radio shattered instantly, its pieces scattering across the ground. But the sound didn't stop. Panicking, I smashed it again and again, until nothing was left but fragments. Then, out of nowhere, the sound cut off. The silence that followed was almost as jarring as the noise had been. The lights stopped flickering, and everything felt normal again. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, staring at the mess I'd made. My mom ran over, pulling me back inside and insisting we stay in the house. Strangely, nothing else happened after that. The radio never came back, and the static didn't return. But to this day, I have no idea what it was, and the sound of those voices still haunts me in my dreams. Something happened to me at the end of last year that, to this day, I can't explain. It was during a fishing trip with two friends, Lucas and Tiago, at a secluded lake about 3 hours drive from the city. We had been there several times before, and I'd always loved the place. No cell signal, just the sound of the trees and the water. Perfect for relaxing. We arrived around 4 p.m., set up our tent near the shore, lit a campfire, and started fishing. It was a peaceful day, clear skies, and the lake was so calm it reflected the sky like a mirror. Everything seemed normal until nightfall. Around 9 p.m., while we were talking and roasting some fish over the fire, Lucas was the first to notice. He pointed to the other side of the lake and asked, "Do you see that?" When I looked, I saw a light. It looked like another campfire, but something was off. There was no one around it, and the light seemed to move. At first, we thought it was just the reflection of our fire on the water or something, but as time passed, it became clear that it wasn't a reflection. The fire across the lake was moving, slowly, as if someone was carrying it, but we couldn't see anyone. At first, we tried to ignore it. It didn't seem like a threat, you know? Maybe it was just another group camping there, but the feeling of unease grew with each passing minute. Tiago even made a joke to lighten the mood, something about ghosts of old fishermen, but no one laughed for real. The strange thing was that even though the light was moving, we couldn't hear a single sound from over there. No footsteps, no snapping branches, nothing. and the place is so quiet that anyone walking near the shore should have made some noise. I started to wonder if we were really seeing a campfire, or if it was some sort of illusion. Still, no one suggested going over there to check. As the night went on, the fire kept moving, always out of reach. It felt like it was watching us, you know? I know that sounds weird, but that's how it felt. By midnight, none of us could truly enjoy the moment anymore. Lucas suggested we put out our fire and get into the tent. Better not attract attention, he said. We all agreed, but honestly, I think none of us wanted to stay outside any longer. So, we put out the fire and climbed into the tent, keeping our flashlights off. The atmosphere was heavy, the kind of silence that feels alive, like something is surrounding you. Even without saying it, I think we all knew something was wrong. I don't know exactly how long we stayed inside, silent. Lucas and Tiago were lying down, but I couldn't close my eyes. I just kept listening to the sounds around us, trying to pick up anything unusual. That's when I heard something that froze me in place. Footsteps. They weren't fast or heavy, but they were there, circling the tent. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the cadence was too regular, too human. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. I didn't know what to do. Open the tent? Stay quiet? My body was completely frozen. The footsteps stopped after a while, but the silence that followed was even worse. Suddenly, Tiago whispered to me, "Did you hear that?" I could only nod, even though he couldn't see me in the dark. Lucas, on the other side, was completely still. And then, something none of us expected happened. A loud noise, like someone had kicked the cooler we left outside, shattered the silence. It was so loud that I almost screamed. None of us moved, none of us spoke. I just knew I wasn't going out there for anything in the world. The footsteps stopped after a while, but the silence that followed was even worse. Suddenly, we heard something being dragged outside. It was a strange sound, like someone slowly pushing something across the ground near the tent. My heart was racing, but none of us dared to open the flap. Lucas whispered something I couldn't make out, and Tiago just stayed completely still. That was when I realized we were all too scared to make any move. The most unsettling part was how little sense it made. There was no wind, no sign of anyone leaving, but it felt like something, or someone, was testing our nerves out there. After the dragging sound, everything went quiet again. The kind of quiet that puts your entire body on edge, you know? The tent felt like a fragile cocoon, as if anything could pierce through it at any moment. That's when we realized the light from the fire was closer. We couldn't see it directly, but the orange glow seeped through the tent's fabric, flickering like a living shadow. That fire wasn't supposed to be there. The lake was wide, and no one could have crossed it so quickly without us hearing something. And even if they had, why bring the fire so close to us? I gathered the courage to do something I now deeply regret. I unzipped a small part of the tent, just enough to peek outside. And there it was, the fire. But what chilled me to the bone was realizing there was no wood, no stones, nothing solid fueling it. The fire seemed to be floating, as if it wasn't burning on anything at all. I looked around and saw no one. No footprints in the ground illuminated by the dim light. No sounds apart from my friend's heavy breathing. I quickly zipped the tent back up, wondering what the hell was going on. After I zipped it shut, we froze. No one said a word, but Tiago started breathing faster, almost panicking. I was about to suggest we try to leave when we heard it again. Footsteps, this time much closer, as if someone was calmly walking around the tent. Lucas grabbed a knife he had brought along, while I held my flashlight so tightly that my fingers began to hurt. The sound continued, slow, deliberate, like whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. When the footsteps finally stopped, the tent was illuminated even brighter, as if the fire was just inches away. Tiago whispered, "We need to leave now." We all agreed, but before we could move, the light suddenly vanished, like someone had snuffed out the fire. We cautiously opened the tent, only to find the lake plunged into darkness. The fire was gone, and there was no sound. But what we saw on the ground made my blood run cold. Footprints. A lot of them, barefoot, circling our entire campsite. The worst part came when we decided to step out and take a closer look. Using our flashlights, we followed the footprints around the campsite. They were fresh, pressed into the damp earth, but they disappeared just a few meters from the shore, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. As we were about to head back to the tent, Lucas tripped over something. At first, we thought it was just a piece of buried wood, but when we shone our lights on the ground, we were horrified. There were 3 shallow holes, like graves, meticulously dug. Each one was the exact size of a person lying down. We didn't stick around to find out more. We packed up as quickly as we could, leaving behind half of our gear, and left before dawn. To this day, none of us can explain what happened that night. There was no sign of anyone else at the lake, no logical reason for those graves to be there. I've never gone back to that place, and every time I think about it, I feel the same chill I felt that night. It's like someone, or something, was waiting for us. It was New Year's Eve, and I was at my parents' apartment on the 8th floor, helping with the preparations. The night was pretty hectic in the building. Kids running up and down the hallways, neighbors coming and going with plates and drinks, and that festive atmosphere taking over the place. Despite the chaos, the hallway on our floor was quieter, which was a relief for me. Around 9 p.m., while I was tidying up by the door, I heard a faint sound, like muffled crying, coming from the hallway. When I opened the door to see what it was, I came face to face with an elderly woman. She seemed fragile, wearing a somewhat old-fashioned white crochet dress, but she was well put together, with a friendly smile. At the time, I didn't question her presence there. She seemed normal. She asked for help finding her cat, a gray feline named Tobias, who had apparently run away from her apartment. I found it a bit strange, since I had never seen that woman in the building before, and I'd lived there since childhood. Still, I asked her where her apartment was, and she pointed down the hall, to one of the units I knew had been empty for some time. That made me hesitate, but I thought maybe it was a relative or a new tenant. The weirdest part was when we got near the door she said was hers, I noticed it was locked with chains on the outside, as if no one had lived there for ages. Still, the woman kept talking about her cat as if she hadn't noticed anything strange. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the chains on the door, trying to process it. It didn't make sense. The building was well maintained, and the superintendent was the type who didn't let anything slip, who locks a door with chains, especially from the inside of an apartment building. When I looked back at her, she seemed unfazed. She kept talking about the cat like it was the most important thing in the world, telling me Tobias was very mischievous and had a habit of running away. I was still trying to come up with an excuse to leave when she asked me to knock on the door and call for the cat. I thought it was strange, but I ended up knocking a couple of times, just to avoid being rude. Of course, no one answered. Meanwhile, she started looking at the ground as if searching for a clue about the cat. That's when I noticed her shoes were odd. They looked like those really old-fashioned styles from the 1950s, and they were spotless, which was strange considering the hallway had marks of dirt from all the people coming and going for the party. Before I could comment on anything, she turned to me and said, "He must be downstairs. Can you come with me?" At that point, I'll admit I felt uncomfortable. I didn't want to go, but at the same time, something about her made it feel impossible to say no. I agreed, almost without thinking, and we headed toward the stairs. We descended the stairs in silence, and the sound of our footsteps echoed through the building. Oddly, it felt like the noise from the party had disappeared. On the floor below, she began calling for the cat in a soft voice, almost like a whisper. "Tobias, come here, dear." The way she spoke gave me chills, but I tried to ignore it. I passed the flashlight of my phone down the hallway, but there was no sign of any cat. Then I noticed something bizarre. One of the doors had scratch marks near the bottom, like they'd been made recently, and the woman went straight to it, as if she knew. "He was here," she said, with a conviction that made me uneasy. When I suggested maybe we should tell the superintendent, her face changed. It wasn't anger, but the friendly smile vanished, and she stared at me for a long moment, too long. "That won't be necessary," she said, in a flat tone. Before I could reply, she started banging on the door with a force that didn't match her appearance. I stepped back a little, feeling my heart race. Who bangs on someone's door like that, especially in the middle of a party? But what happened next was even worse. Suddenly, the scratching noises on the door started again, like something was clawing from the inside. I froze. The sound was real, loud, and desperate, like something was trying to get out of there. I looked at the woman, but she seemed completely calm, almost indifferent. That made it worse. She just looked at me and said, "You see? He's in there." The way she said it was odd, like she was testing my reaction. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Call someone? But it felt like my feet were glued to the floor. When I finally worked up the courage to say that none of this made sense, the door just opened. No one touched it. No key. Nothing. It just slowly opened, and the hallway grew cold. I can't explain what I felt at that moment. It was like the air suddenly became heavy, and a strange smell filled the place. Something like mold mixed with iron. I peeked through the gap in the door, but the apartment was completely empty. Just darkness that felt wrong, like it was swallowing the light from the hallway. That's when I realized. The woman wasn't beside me anymore. I looked around, trying to figure out where she had gone, but the hallway was empty. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and even though every fiber of my being screamed to leave, I ended up stepping into the apartment. The smell was even worse inside, almost unbearable. The air felt thicker, and every movement I made caused the floorboards to creak in a way that echoed through the empty space. I passed my phone's flashlight over the place, and everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had stepped foot in there for decades. That's when, in the corner of the room, I saw something that made my stomach turn. It was a cat, or rather, what was left of one. The body was partially decomposed, like it had been there for weeks, maybe months. The smell made sense now. I stood frozen, trying to understand how this was possible. Was this Tobias? And if it was, how could he be there, dead, when that woman had said he'd run away? I crouched down, not wanting to get too close, and noticed that the body was covered in scratch marks, like it had fought something before it died. The detail that completely terrified me was the fine chain around the cat's neck, still gleaming as if it were new. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, my whole body tense, expecting to see the woman, but there was no one there. The apartment was completely empty, except for the dead cat and the unbearable smell. My heart raced, and for a moment, I felt completely lost, like I was in a nightmare. Then I heard a whisper, faint, almost like a voice coming from the back of the room. "You shouldn't have come." Panic took over me, and my instinct was just to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. I didn't know what was real anymore. Everything felt too surreal. I ran to the door, my hands shaking, and when I finally managed to open it, I came face to face with the superintendent, who was standing in the hallway, looking at me with a strange expression. He seemed confused, like he didn't know why he was there. I asked him what he was doing, but he just looked at me and, without saying a word, turned and walked away. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was so shaken up I just wanted to get home and forget everything. When I went back to my apartment, I tried to tell my family what had happened, but deep down, I knew no one would believe me. The next day, the superintendent came looking for me, and when he saw how rattled I was, he tried to reassure me. When I asked about the apartment, he confirmed that it had been empty for years. No one had ever lived there, and when I mentioned the woman, he had a strange look on his face, saying he'd never seen anyone like her. I even tried asking about the cat, but he just shook his head and changed the subject. The worst part is, after everything, I still don't know what to make of that strange feeling. Like something had connected in a way that didn't make sense. The woman, the cat, the empty apartment. I never could walk down that hallway again without feeling a chill. I don't understand what happened, but honestly, I don't want to know. Something in that place wasn't right, and deep down, I know it wasn't just my imagination.